Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Psychology 1888, Milestones and Minds That Shape the Field, your psychology year in review. Today, we are going to be going over some really exciting things that took place within the field of psychology in the late 1880s. We're going to touch on the creation of a scientific journal, developments in statistical analysis, the first psychology professorship here in the Western world, and the area of parapsychology. So stay tuned for a really stimulating discussion. My name is Yamina, and today I'm joined by student researchers Jaden, Ikran, and Zainab. Thank you all for joining me today.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, I'm super excited about this.
I think we have some really fun topics to get through today.
So before we get into our discussion, let's set the scene. What was happening in the world in 1887?
Industrialization was in full swing. Factories, cities, and new technologies were booming. According to Fancher and Rutherford's Pioneers of Psychology, the 2023 edition, this massive shift brought attention to issues like productivity, education, and even mental health.
And psychology became super relevant because of that. People wanted to understand how workers think and how kids learn. Stuff that could make society run more smoothly.
Exactly, and culturally, this was also the time when German psychology was a huge influence. Stanley G. Hall studied under Wilhelm Wundt in Leipzig, Germany. Wundt's lab was basically the birthplace of experimental psychology, and Hall took those methods back to the U.S.
Yeah, once he got back to the U.S., he established the American Journal of Psychology in 1887. It's such a huge moment for psychology, right?
Definitely. Hall basically put psychology on the map in the U.S. with that move.
Oh, Fancher and Rutherford mentioned that too. Hall didn't just import Wundt's ideas, he adapted them. By founding the journal, he made sure American psychologists had a place to publish their own research. Before that, psychology wasn't really seen as separate from philosophy.
Right, and that's where the journal played a big role. Larry talks about this in The Rise of American Psychology from 1988. Hall used the American Journal of Psychology to carve out a space for psychology as its own scientific discipline.
Which makes sense historically, right? The 1880s were all about professionalizing science. Universities were starting to focus more on research, not just teaching.
And Hall was at Johns Hopkins University when he launched the journal. Johns Hopkins was one of those cutting-edge places investing in research and specialization. According to Hortschall's History of Psychology, the 2021 edition, wealthy donors like Carnegie and Rockefeller were pouring money into higher education, which made all of this possible. There was actually quite a bit of drama concerning this. Fancher and Rutherford said that Hall attracted a very wealthy member of the American Society for Psychical Research who donated $500, which was a lot of money at the time, under the assumption that Hall would be favorable of this line of research. Unfortunately, Hall's goal was to make the new journal rigorously scientific and empirical.
That's so interesting because it wasn't just about science for Hall. He saw psychology as practical too. It wasn't just, let's study the mind for fun. He wanted to solve real problems like improving education or addressing mental illness.
Totally. That fits with the progressive era's vibe. Like using science to reform society, psychology was perfect for that moment.
So when Hall launched the journal in 1887, it wasn't just a publication. It was like planting a flag. He was saying, psychology is legit, and here's the evidence to prove it.
And what's cool is how it set the stage for psychology as we know it. The journal helped bring together ideas from different areas: experimental research, education, and even cultural psychology.
And it gave American psychologists a platform. Before that, if you wanted to publish, you'd have to rely on European journals. This made psychology more accessible to researchers here.
Plus, it helped shift psychology away from philosophy. Hall and his journal were all about empirical evidence, experiments, and data.
And that really resonated in a society obsessed with progress and innovation. I mean, it's the late 19th century. People are inventing light bulbs and skyscrapers. A science of the mind fits right in with that energy.
Yeah, Hall basically tapped into the spirit of the time. The American Journal of Psychology wasn't just a milestone for the field. It reflected the bigger changes happening in society.
And it laid out the groundwork for psychology's future. I mean, without it, who knows how long it would have taken for psychology to become its own thing in the U.S.
So true. Hall wasn't just founding a journal, he was building a moment.
And now psychology is everywhere. It's wild to think how much of this started with one guy in 1887.
Definitely. Hall and his journal really changed the game, and it's cool to see how it all connects to the bigger picture.
On our next topic, does everyone here like stats?
No.
Well, too bad, because that's our next topic of discussion. We all know Francis Galton, cousin of very famous English naturalist Charles Darwin, right? Well, Galton has his own accomplishments. He's a biologist and geologist, known for the theory of natural selection from 1959.
He's the one who talked about the psychology of individual differences, right?
Yes, he made a really exciting breakthrough during this year. He published a short research paper on statistical correlation.
I don't know if you all know this, but Fanker and Rutherford mentioned that Galton was allegedly extremely sexist.
Really?
Yeah, he thought women were not that intelligent and had less accurate senses than men.
It was probably common for men to think that way in the 1880s. Feminism has come so far from that time period.
Right. Moving back to statistical correlation, what is it exactly?
Statistical correlation measures the strength of the association between two related variables.
So, suddenly he's a mathematician? I thought he was a biologist.
He was a biologist, but biology itself has had its contribution to statistical correlation. I would say this invention resulted from a domino effect. Fancher and Rutherford talk about how first it started with Darwin and his contributions in biology, then leading to Galton's contributions in biology, like his studies on eugenics. Then, after this, he came up with two very important inventions, intelligence tests and statistical correlation. For me, I find statistical correlation the most interesting.
So how did he come up with statistical correlation anyways?
He wanted to find a way of comparing different variables and took a quantitative approach for this comparison. In the first paper, Francis Galton's account of the intervention of correlation by Stephen Ziegler, published in 1890, he used two variables which were the heights of 928 adult children and the heights of their parents. Though this, he coined statistical correlation, which is the mathematical process for measuring the strength of association between two variables.
It is important for us to differentiate between correlation and causation, though.
Definitely. Causation is when one variable is the direct result of another, but correlation simply means that there is a statistical relationship between two or more variables. It's about how well two variables connect that appear on paper.
So correlation is like an association between variables.
Like, if your parents are tall, it's likely you'll be tall, but not all of the time. It just happens to be more frequent and common, making the connection stronger.
Right. Another good example would be the association between sleep and mood.
How do you think Galton would use his statistical analysis for that?
Galton would probably place this data on a scatter plot to organize this data. Then, he would be able to visualize how the data is organized. This is where he'll be able to view the correlations, and from the article I mentioned, this is what led him to inventing the idea of statistical correlation.
Fun fact, he also created the scatter plot, which led to other statistical inventions, which I'll bring up at the end of our talk, and this was mentioned in the textbook.
I think it's crazy how his background in biology connected him to the coining of statistical correlation.
Yeah, Fancher and Rutherford talk about how Galton's work built on years of research in heredity and regression with his cousin Darwin, culminating in his realization of a generalizable method to quantify relationships between variables. Stephen Stigler's 1890 account of Francis Galton's invention of correlation in 1888 talks about how Galton was able to apply his findings to older publishing of his.
Really? But those studies were already completed.
You're right, but after Galton the goat himself invented statistical correlation, he used this invention and found an association in his previous research, which he never discovered before. This was also mentioned in Stephen Stigler's publication.
In this case, Galton published a previous article with data about heights in a different year, with no information about correlation. Then once he discovered the association between the variables, he republished his results again in 1889. This article was the one I mentioned earlier by Stephen Stigler.
And this was such an important discovery, right? We use statistical correlation for so much nowadays, don't we?
Another example of statistical correlation could be the more classes a student misses, the more likely the grades are to decrease.
The invention of statistical correlation is a great contribution to statistics, and we see that throughout the years. For example, Carl Pearson expanded on his research creating persons R, which happened after Galton's contribution.
In addition to this, we as psychology students use statistical correlation in some of our courses. In Quantification in Psychology 1 and 2, statistical correlation is a very interesting topic, and you learn how to compute certain problems using this method.
Galton's contributions back in the day gives us hands-on experience with actual variables. We were learning it, now we're doing it. Some of us may use it in our thesis as well by studying the relationship between two or more variables.
I know there is one other person who also had a lot of appreciation of the hard work Galton did as he built on top of it in his own research.
Yes, and that is Mr. James McKeen Cattell.
What's so special about him? Fancher and Rutherford said he was a professor at the University of Cambridge.
Yes, and that same source talks about how he was the first official professor of psychology at the University of Pennsylvania in 1888.
Many might not realize how big of a deal that was. Cattell wasn't just a psychologist. He was an innovator who really wanted to show that psychology is just as important and scientific as any other field like biology or physics. In that time period, people didn't think of psychology as a serious standalone discipline.
To become a social science, psychology had to overcome the influence of religion. It also had to establish independence from philosophy to be seen as its own field. Cattell played a key role in making this happen.
Definitely. And wasn't he all about using experiments and measurements to prove that psychology wasn't just abstract philosophy? He was one of the first to say, let's put numbers on this.
Yep, that would be the psychometrics part, right? It was at Cambridge University where Cattell really began developing these methods to measure human abilities. He worked with Francis Galton, who was already doing cool stuff with statistics and individual differences.
Yes, Fancher and Rutherford mentioned that James McKeen Cattell's groundbreaking work in psychology was largely attributed to his time spent with Francis Galton in Cambridge from 86 to 88.
Galton inspired Cattell to think, hey, we can measure intelligence, reaction times, memories, and such scientifically. It was all about bringing quantifiable data into psychology.
The University of Cambridge in 2008 stated that the first laboratory dedicated to the subject was set up within the Cavendish Physics Laboratory at the University of Cambridge by James McKeen Cattell in 1887.
The guy was dedicated, and he took that same mindset to the University of Pennsylvania. Fun fact, he designed what we now call mental tests. In his 1890 paper, Mental Tests and Measurements, he talks about using tests to study how people differ.
And by integrating Galton's methods with his own research, Cattell developed the first mental tests, bridging experimental psychology with quantifiable assessment tools, which is a foundation for modern psychological testing.
Ooh, and isn't that the foundation of psychometrics as a whole? Like today, we have IQ tests, personality assessments, and even standardized testing in schools, all thanks to the seeds Cattell planted back then.
Totally. And he was doing it at a time when psychology was still figuring itself out. Cattell was proving psychology could go beyond introspection. It could tackle real-world questions with measurable tools.
And Cambridge was the perfect place for that. Galton's influence was huge. But don't forget Charles Darwin too. The vibe there was all about exploring individual differences, which totally shaped Cattell's approach.
Yeah, it's fascinating. By the time Cattell left Cambridge and became the first professor of psychology in the US, he was basically saying, okay, America, let's do this. He brought that experimental rigor to the States and inspired a new generation of psychologists to adopt scientific methods.
Interesting. And now look where we are. Psychology is this massive, and now a very respected field of science. It's pretty wild to think how much of that traces back to those early years in Cambridge and at the University of Pennsylvania.
All thanks to the James McKeen Cattell, a guy who basically said, let's put the science in psychological science.
And we owe him for that. Psychometrics, mental testing, Cattell was already sketching out the roadmaps back then. So yeah, big respect for the OG professor of psychology in the US.
An article on IPA PsychNet talked further about Cattell's, who has a daughter who went on to develop tests to assess intelligence in children.
Another student of his was Edward Thorndike, who is referred to as a pioneer of educational psychology. So it seems like his teaching made him very influential.
Taking a bit of a hard left here, have you guys ever heard of parapsychology?
Is that like a paranormal movie?
No, but it does kind of sound like one. The term parapsychology was coined in 1889, correct? What does it mean?
Yes, this theory explains paranormal effects caused by the mysterious power psi, like telepathy, precognition, telekinesis, near-death experiences, reincarnation, and more.
That sounds so cool. But do psychologists even believe in this stuff?
Although about 50% of people believe in paranormal phenomena, the scientific community does not formally recognize it as a serious field of research, which makes it difficult to study it scientifically.
I can see that. How would you even measure that stuff?
To study telekinesis or psychokinesis, the ability to move objects with just thought, many different experimental methods are used.
Like what?
In a study conducted by Bosch et al., participants were asked to change the number distribution to create a bias. Although many studies showed possible positive results, larger reviews suggested the effect was probably due to publication bias.
Oh wow, telekinesis. What about telepathy? I know that is a popular thing in paranormal movies too.
Yes, the Gonsfeld test is a popular experiment that investigates telepathy, just like in the movies.
Okay, so let me guess. Based on the movies I have seen, the experiment included a receiver and an sender.
Yup, they're placed in different rooms and are asked to transport information telepathically.
That sounds kind of silly. How does that even work?
I think it sounds cool.
Kinda, Storm et al. Conducted a meta-analysis of 29 experiments suggesting that psi-conductive people perform better in Gonsfeld test in 2010. However, skeptic Ray Hyman argued that many Gonsfeld experiments were flawed, such as lacking proper sensory deprivation and failing to replicate.
So, overall, there is no reliable proof, I guess. These studies lack the proper controls and are unable to obtain valid and reliable results. I believe we should avoid this topic for future studies.
Yeah, another popular parapsychological phenomenon is precognition, or future vision.
Fortune telling has been a thing for decades after all.
Yeah, and modern methods to study precognition include using random event generators.
Helmut Schmidt was a popular investigator in the field, as I heard.
He claimed that random participants had a higher than average success rate in predicting events across many trials.
However, his research was never really replicated, and he was criticized for performing the experiments alone.
Does that mean he could have lied about all that stuff?
Precisely.
It's so interesting to see something like parapsychology compared to the development of psychometrics at the time.
Definitely. One perspective was extremely rigorous and empirical, while the other was, well, let's just say not very scientific.
Right. Galton and McKean were so interested in empiricism, and this area of parapsychology is definitely very different from that.
Yeah, they definitely tried, but unfortunately their research did not have the same rigor as many others at the time.
To end up our discussion, we have a small review question to discuss. What do you think from a personal perspective and from your background in psychology about these events?
I'm a big fan of math, so personally I think that the development of statistical correlation was interesting. I was able to apply this knowledge in our statistics course through mathematical problems and SPSS.
I agree. Statistical correlation is very important and it sets the groundwork for making psychology a proper science.
Parapsychology was pretty interesting, but I don't know much about it.
Parapsychology does not have much evidence to back it up, so it's hard to formulate an opinion.
It would be so interesting if people started looking into researching it more now.
And it was interesting to hear about the person who helped establish psychology as a science.
Right? Without Cattell, so many other psychologists might not have considered studying psychology, and it wouldn't have developed to what it is today. Overall, the late 1880s were an exciting time for psychology and psychological research.
Big moves were made in the way of making psychology an empirical science, some better than others, and many important figures broke through and made some very interesting changes and discoveries within this field.
Thank you so much for joining us on Psychology 1888, Milestones and Minds That Shaped the Field, your psychology year in review. For our discussion on the history of psychology today, we hope you learned something new about how psychology came to be what it is today.